Enamel is oil based. It is far stronger and superior to acrylic. The colours look more lusher, more brighter, the glossier. Also scratch resistant, though it's a little harsher and not as friendly as acrylics. The fumes can be a tad harmful. You do need a little more stronger thinner, which Tamiya does make, or something like mineral turpentine or lighter fluid. Lighter fluid would be good for thinning it down, though mineral turpentine would be good as a cleanup. Example of enamels, normally in small metal tins or glass bottles. We have Revell that I used in my childhood, Humbrol, Tamiya and Testors. I mostly like using Tamiya. Enamels are normally very, very good for inking and very, very good for hand painting. Normally they all thin down very well with Tamiya X20 thinner. It'll have enamel paint written on it. I also find no problems thinning with lighter fluid, which is a slightly cheaper option. And when cleaning up, mineral turpentine. And lacquers. Lacquers have the absolute most superior finish and quality, though they're quite hazardous to breathe in. We'll talk about the dangers of that fairly soon. Also, it can only be thinned with lacquer thinner, and it can only be cleaned up with general purpose lacquer thinner. A really cool thing about this is it dries via the evaporation of the thinner. So once the thinner is evaporated, as soon as you add the thinner back to dried lacquer paint, it will return or constitute back into paint. With the other ones, once they dried, because they normally dry chemically via air, if you try to reconstitute them with their own thinner, most likely nothing will happen or you'll damage your paintwork. Lacquers, normally found in Tamiya spray cans. Also primers. And you'll find that Goons, the Mr. Hobby colour, will have them in metallics with the special lid, and normals. And also new paint for Gaia, which I believe is from Hong Kong. To thin them down you need lacquer thinner. Mr. Hobby does one. I believe Gaia also does one. But 100% of the time just general purpose thinner or premium thinner is just good enough. You'll find them in your auto or hardware stores. When spraying with enamels or lacquers, you must wear a half or full face gas respirator, like so, securely placed over the mouth, because this is very harmful paints for your lungs. And when you keep a respirator, either have something that closes the filter so dust doesn't gather in, so it becomes ineffective and you can't breathe, or keep it in like a Tupperware or plastic container to keep it away from dust. And last but not least, oils. Not really applicable to scale models besides figures. I absolutely know nothing about them. Don't know if you could put them through an airbrush. So far we'll only concentrate on these three types. Okay, lacquer paint contains something called VOC, or volatile organic compounds. I'm not 100% sure about the scientific meaning behind it. All I know is it sort of damages our ozone layer and kind of, lets the whole UV ray global warming scenario. Very controversial. I'm not going to say if I believe it or not, though more or less it's harmful for the environment, and if it's harmful for the environment, it's extremely harmful for people. Leads to something called organic solvent syndrome. I'm also not 100% sure what the hell that is or what it means, but what I do know is older modelers who've been painting for many, many years, particularly people working in car factories, they have some serious bad respiratory issues. They can't breathe to save their life. They're hooked up to machinery. Now this is hardcore industrial use. I'm not saying that we use very little so it doesn't matter. I'm just saying if you are going to be using those Tamiya spray cans, or if you are going to be spraying primer or Mr. Hobby, do it with a respirator and a vac booth, or do it outside. Just try to not breathe this stuff as much as possible. it is pretty damn dangerous. I believe in the United States they've completely banned import from Japan, so in the US it's hard to buy lacquer paint for hobbies. I know for some unknown reason Australia has jumped on, and most hobby shops don't stock lacquer for hell from Asia. I know we get outclad from the United Kingdom, and it's all starting to get way too expensive. So sort of save this paint when you're a little more experienced, and make sure to take some safety precautions. Next thing we're going to talk about is what paint, once dried onto a surface, is compatible with another paint being applied on top. Believe it or not, when you're layering levels of paint, particularly when you're masking, different types of paint are not compatible. Mostly the stronger paints put on top of a weaker paint can dissolve or damage the weaker paint. By example, the strongest paint being lacquer, because it's thinner so strong, if you put that as the base, such as a primer, there is very little you can actually put on top of that primer when fully dried that will damage it. Though if, let's say, you put down an acrylic coat of Tamiya, and then you start spraying Mr. Hobby on top of the Tamiya, like a varnish, you'll actually notice underneath the acrylic paint will start to dissolve and will leave a undesirable effect. So you just need to remember that more or less most of the solvent-based paints can attack acrylic and water-based. Generally, enamels are very strong. They, once fully dried, nor lacquer nor acrylic will affect it. Lacquer is very strong, so you can put that as a base. Nothing can affect it. But once you paint something with acrylic paint, you cannot go backwards. You cannot put enamel on top of acrylic unless it's slightly hand painted. If you're airbrushing it on, airbrush has a lot more solvent on board, so that could actually do some damage. And you cannot put lacquer on top of acrylic whatsoever, because it is highly risky. If you do wish to experiment and see what does what, get a bit of the leftover sprue from models and paint them different colours in different type of paint, and once fully cured, put different paints on and see what happens. I've done this myself. It's actually extremely interesting. The last one is curing. With each binder and solvent type, because there's different ways of curing, some chemically, some by UV, some by oxygen, they all dry at a different rate. They both mature at a different rate. And if you're unsure, you need to leave the piece untouched for a maximum amount of time as possible. If you paint something with acrylic, it's the fastest drying, though it could take a little time to mature. Drying is when a paint's in a wet form and it goes into a solid putty-like form. And from that putty form, even though it can feel hard by touch, is still bonding itself, chemically changing to be a solid matter. Enamel, from wet to dry, your drying time is a lot longer, and its maturity rate is also long. Lacquer is very quick, but it does take an extremely long time to mature. So a general rule of thumb that I apply is when you paint acrylic, wait for a few hours to dry. To be absolutely safe, several hours. When you paint enamel, wait for 1 day to dry as a minimum, and about 3 days as a maximum, depending on the thickness and depending on your environment. And with lacquer, generally allow a few days either way, because it's fairly unpredictable lacquer. So far we've covered everything I personally know about paint. This is near the extent of my knowledge. The best advice I can possibly give to any painter, be it hand painting, can painting, airbrush, is you need to be as patient as possible. I do apologise if it's a little dry and bland, though this knowledge is quite important. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, we're going to learn about the setup of an airbrush, how an airbrush goes together, where you can pick one up, how you can buy one, how to look after it, just about the airbrush. We're going to look at it, and that's about